In this episode of Risk First Stars of Software, I'm joined by James McLeod, open source program lead at NatWest Group and a board member of FINOS. James has spent years at the heart of open source in financial services, helping to build communities, shape strategy, and bring open collaboration into environments that aren't always naturally set up for it. Before NatWest, he led community efforts at FINOS itself, working across the industry to connect firms, developers, and projects in a way that actually delivers value. But what really stands out about James is his focus on people. Alongside his day job, he's the organiser behind London JS, a long-running community bringing developers together in London. And he's been a consistent advocate for the idea that open source opens doors, not just for organisations, but for individuals building their careers. So James, hi, welcome to the podcast. Good to see you.
Wow. Yeah, thank you very much, Rob. It's so great to be on your podcast. Normally I'm inviting people onto something that I'm doing. It's really good to be part of somebody else's kind of like drive. Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Well, we'll have to go through all that at the end, and you can like shout out all the stuff that you've got going on. Because every time I log on to LinkedIn, you've got like 4 or 5 posts queued up for me to look at with all the different like live coding and all sorts of stuff you're doing. So you're really active, and there's
yeah. Let's go through it. Let's go through the whole lot, and
all right. But let's start at the beginning then. So how did you get into open source? Where did your open source journey start?
Oh, wow. That's actually a really good question. So I remember when I was at university, so just after I came out of university, I got a job within a Microsoft environment. So I was originally developing using, Visual Studio C++ at that time. And everything was SQL Server, even in the early 2000s, it kind of transitioned into .NET. But everything was like deeply proprietary, where Microsoft would, provide you the engineering platform, the frameworks, all of the servers, so the operating systems, all the way through to, even the servers or the web servers that, were distributing your sites through IIS. Even the browser, so it was like Internet Explorer. So I was like deeply kind of like, I was a bit of a Microsoft fanboy. And at that time, all of the firms were trying to get, gold certification, and everybody who was, a software engineer at that time was trying to become Microsoft certified. And that continued probably for the first, up to 10 years of my career, from 2000 all the way through to, 2010. At around the 2010 point, maybe a little bit before that, it was MySQL kind of, appeared on the horizon, because there was always a bit of a, a little bit of competition between Microsoft and Oracle. And at that time, I worked in Reading on Thames Valley Business Park, and that's where the two kind of main campuses for Microsoft and Oracle were. They were kind of, facing each other. And so I worked on a startup, and there was like this real kind of like tussle between, are you a, MS SQL, developer, or you're an Oracle developer? And then there was a bit of a rumbling about, there's a new database that's, free to use. It's hit the landscape. It's called MySQL. And I think this was before, GitHub. I think that people, kind of got it off of, distribution sites. I'm trying to remember the names of the sites. It will come back to me in a second.
There was SourceForge, wasn't there? That was one of them.
It was SourceForge. I think that you downloaded the binaries from there and you could use it. And the whole concept of it being, licensed for open and, making contributions into it was like really new. Within the area of software engineering that I was working, I was working back end, but then I slowly got into front end development, because I moved from being, this can sound, I don't know, I don't want to sound too casual, but I was working on some pretty, when I first entered the industry, I was working within telecommunications. So I was doing voice over IP development straight out of university. And I thought, I'd really like to get into the entertainment industry. And so I did some work for BBC and ITV. And then I started, getting involved in brand campaigns. So I would support, Glastonbury, and get involved in doing some front-end developer around, the different ciders that they would have in Glastonbury. And it was around the 2010 point where, you know, we weren't doing forms anymore on, you know, whatever it was, Firefox or Internet Explorer. We're actually engaging with the DOM more. And so you could actually do some, you know, development directly with the DOM using JavaScript. And go from, you know, submitting forms into doing, you know, basic animation. And that's where I kind of got into the jQuery world. I
Yeah.
remember somebody saying, "Oh yeah, you know, have you ever used jQuery?" Because I was working, you know, amongst all of these like real creative, you know, front end developers, and I was saying, "No, I've never really done that." And they introduced me to jQuery, and of course, you know, jQuery now people aren't really using it, but I think it's still part of OpenJS Foundation, you know, or if it's not, it was, you know, until recently. And so it's still knocking about. And so my first introduction was, you know, using, you know, MySQL. My second introduction was using jQuery at the time, so 2010, 2011. And then it kind of just, you know, rolled into that. You then got, you know, NoSQL databases. And then, you know, lots of different frameworks like Backbone and Ember.js. And I remember Angular coming onto the market, and all of these were open source. React.js, you know, kind of entered the marketplace. And then clients started asking for these frameworks, you know, so open source kind of hit the mainstream. And, you know, people were saying, oh, yeah, we need things, you know, developed, you know, using React. Nobody knew how to use it, you know, because we're all kind of transitioning kind of, you know, through all of these different frameworks because there are so many and they're all competing. They're all kind of like breaking changes, you know, between versions. And so React hit the market, and that's when London JS was born because we all needed to learn React at that time together. And so, yeah, it was kind of like a bit of a, I don't know, what do you call it? Kind of a primordial soup of like all of these technologies. But that was my first intro, kind of just being pulled in by other developers and needing to learn it. And there not being an MSDN at that time to kind of pick up on your, you know, CD-ROM that gave you all of the answers. You had to work everything out. And so it just kind of like began from there, really.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think like, I mean, I remember it was Angular, wasn't it? And then it came, React came along, and then there was Handlebars and all these, just this profusion of like open source frameworks on the JavaScript side. It was mental because you just didn't know which way to turn and what to use or anything. And so I can sort of see how like that setting up a community for people dealing with that exact problem would be a really good idea.
Yeah, I mean, handlebars. I mean, we talk about handlebars, you know.
Oh yeah, I forgot to mention your amazing beard in the introduction. That's an oversight.
Yeah, I wasn't, you know, I was clean shaven, you know, then, you know, this is relatively new compared to then. But I remember handlebars. It was kind of like a task runner that allowed you to build, you know, front end sites, at least if I'm remembering. And then you got like Webpack and all of these, you know, then you got the introduction of Node, I suppose, you know, that allowed you to, you know, build all of the, you know, sites from, you know, front end to back end.
And
Node
things like NPM came along, didn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, it's really versatile, and everyone was really confused about it because, you know, you were kind of stuck in your environment, you know, so you compiled things, you know, using your IDE, or you ran something using your, you know, specific server, and then Node came along and it could do everything. You know, it was like, you know, it was like so versatile that people were like really confused and really trying to understand its purpose. And now it's just there in the background, you know, powering a lot of stuff that you wouldn't even know.
So let's talk a bit about like London JS and just communities in general, because I think you've like hit upon a key point there, which is like people often need like the wisdom of the crowds in order to pick the right technology choices. And often they need to see like their colleagues or like their peers using something in order to try and figure out whether it's going to be a good fit for them. I think like, obviously this is the Risk First podcast, and what I try and do is reframe everything in terms of risk. So I kind of feel like almost what you're trying to do with a community sometimes is try and manage that like communication risk, and that trying to make sure people are choosing the right technologies, that dependency risk kind of angle. Is that one of the things you try and cover in London JS?
Yeah. So if I think about risk, So if I go back to the days when we were all learning React, there wasn't a go-to place for all of the answers. All of the versions iterated really quickly, as
Yeah.
it does within open source. You don't stick to one version for that long before something else comes. And if you think about the JavaScript, kind of ecosystem in general, there's not kind of like one fixed environment that you develop against. Everything is kind of transient dependencies, and you can fit things together in lots of different ways, and it's non-opinionated. And so, there's lots of different ways in which you can stitch things together. And so if you're coming from a deeply proprietary environment, where, versions of frameworks like the .NET framework, or even in Java, I would imagine, where things have been provided for you. Although, I do know that Java, you have Spring Boot and, you have Maven as well. And so maybe Java's a bit different to .NET. When you enter the JavaScript environment, you're looking for the answers. It's like, I was working for a consultancy at that time, and they would say, "Oh, can you bring in a consultant who can teach us all about this?" And even I was part of that. Let's look for, that one person who can teach us how to do it. And it's like, well, if you look at NPM, you've got, a whole array of, different modules and, libraries that you can bring down and use. It's very difficult for one person to teach you that. You need to understand, the pattern of development. But we did, we sought out, somebody who was developing React Router at the time. There's a guy called Michael Jackson, funny enough. And that isn't a joke. I mean, if you Google him, Michael Jackson, kind of like React Router, lead maintainer at that time.
Nice.
Absolutely brilliant guy. And he was there with Kenzie Dots and another guy called Ryan. I can't remember Ryan's surname, but they actually came over from the US, so they were West Coast, probably quite close to the Linux Foundation, to teach us how to develop in React, and develop, using JavaScript. And it's like, that you can't maintain that. If your source of truth is, one person on the West Coast who's offering these services as, a consultant, you've got to distribute that risk. That's risky. The guy had to fly,
So who were you working for at this point?
I was working for Sapient, funny enough.
Okay, so he came to see Sapient, did he? Is that?
Yeah.
Right.
We employed in his service. He came over from the West Coast, ran maybe 5 days of, React consultancy.
Yeah.
And we thought, look, we're just going to have to, figure it out. It's totally agile. We didn't know that the way that you figured it out was to start a meetup. We thought, first of all, let's do some brown bag sessions internally and get everyone together to talk through what they learned at that time. We were doing it week on week. And then meetups were kind of on the scene because there were Angular meetups, there were Ember meetups. And so I thought, maybe we can invite, the general public in and, see if we can get some learning from, the wider community who were, maybe a little bit ahead, but, often, behind us as well. And so learning, from that kind of democratized, ecosystem was a way that we could keep ourselves current and also, remove the risk of being, totally tethered to the West Coast of the US. And that way, we're able to grow kind of, the London community, which was more Shoreditch, because it was a little bit tied to the City of London still, as it is at the moment. But yeah, otherwise, I think, the only pattern of learning that we had at that time was either O'Reilly books, MSDN, DVDs, or going to Stack Overflow, but maybe even Stack Overflow was, I don't know if that was really a
Probably
thing.
the early days of that, right?
Yeah. And I think, GitHub was there. Yeah, GitHub must have been there because, we had maintainers from Meta who were then just Facebook at the time because Meta and Facebook in London were massive. They had a lot of their lead maintainers of the React JS framework, around, I think it's Euston, around that area. And so we're able to invite some of those guys in and build a rapport with, the people at Facebook, which was pretty cool.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, you're kind of trying to diffuse information across,
Yeah.
large numbers of developers and make sure that they understand the technology. And you're right. I mean, there's different people have different sort of styles of picking stuff up as well. Some people like to just read a book, or some people like to watch a video, or some people prefer to go and talk to somebody face to face and like be able to
Yeah.
ask questions and stuff. And I think, yeah, there's room for all of those different styles in the world of open source, and you've got to,
Oh, yeah.
apply all of them, right?
One of
Yeah.
the one of the cultural kind of like, rules that we set up at that time, which, still stands true today, is that it wasn't going to be a meetup for like rock stars and lead maintainers with, hundreds and thousands of followers.
Right.
We wanted it to be for, boot campers all the way through to, executive directors or CIOs to come in and be able to talk. It was a platform
Yeah.
for people to be able to, find their confidence in order to be able to learn and also, just pass information on. So we totally removed the fear of failure. There are people doing live coding demos where it just fell on its face, and we applauded it because it's not easy. All of that
No,
stuff,
no,
comes with risk. Quite often you're using somebody else's Wi-Fi because, somebody sponsored it and said, come and do it in our, I don't know, auditorium or, one of our meeting rooms. And you say, do you have a guest Wi-Fi? You're on there. And then you're running a live demo against somebody's network that you've never tried against.
yeah, it's a
And
high
so,
wire act, isn't it?
yeah, it really
I think
is.
that's part of the fun of it, really, isn't it? Well, certainly,
Oh, yeah.
I was advancing this theory to all my colleagues in FINOS the other day, that we have a unusually high number of performers of some
Yeah.
kind or other within the team. Like, there's at least 3 people do ballet, and it's like,
Yeah.
that's that compared to the national average of the number of people who do ballet, it's just ridiculously high proportion. So, and that can't be just chance. That must be like that. There's some interest in like performance, and that, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I
But
do think that, the open source community does bring a particular personality type into it. I don't want to stereotype at the same time, but,
yeah.
we do tend to, rub along pretty well. And, just, give each other plenty of space and get involved in things. We're very open to that, all sorts of different things.
What about so I guess people talk a little bit about networking, like as communities, as a way of like networking with other people. I don't think I'm very good at networking, so I'm not the best person to talk about this. But do you think it helps with like career advancements when you go to things like open source meetups and stuff like
The
that? Is that
meetup. Oh, Rob, I've got to be careful what I say. Right. So if I let you and everybody, who's listening to us talk, hear this, if it wasn't for, at that time, it was React.js. It was React.js Bring Your Own project. And then it kind of morphed into London.js after COVID, because, the whole JavaScript, ecosystem diversified, so it's very kind of like, it's very broad now. It's not just React. It used to be pretty much just React at that time. I wouldn't be in the role that I am now if it wasn't for the meetup. That is literally kind of, an idea spark that has, grown into, defining somebody's career.
yeah.
And I can put it pretty much solely down to that meetup. I would hazard a guess that meetup has got me to exactly where I am in my career now. Seriously.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, I think that's a great example of like giving to the open source community and it paying you back, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I wasn't really specifically talking about you. I was like thinking more for like people who come along to the London JS meetups and like maybe.
Rob, I can give you so many examples.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm not saying me specifically because the other co-leads who have been involved, over the years, I've always had help, and Will and Jordan, who are the co-leads that are now with me, are absolutely phenomenal. So it's not centered around me anymore. I would actually say that Will and Jordan, they do the heavy lifting around London JS now. And it's, nice to see it evolve into somebody else's vision. I feel, really proud that I've been able to, take it so far, and allow it to, grow other people in the way that they also need to grow. But along that journey through, the original maintainers, who are part of it with me up until now, I've seen, people who have been presenting at London JS, get together and form, small startups. And, there have
Wow.
been people from London JS and React London at that time, who have gone for, angel investment and, moved over to the West Coast. There was, one group who, I don't want to mention people's names. I don't think that that's fair. They were able to come together and start, working, within the gaming industry. And at that time, they're almost like, it's like a sub-narrative. And it's not necessarily stuff that you are aware of. From my point of view, it's just bringing people together in order to learn stuff. Whatever actually happens off the back of that is an unintended consequence, but sometimes those unintended consequences can actually lead to great things. But the thing that is different is that it's, the meetup itself isn't licensed, and if it was, it'll probably be like a Creative Commons license, something like that, where you can just, kind of use the materials freely. There's no kind of IP bound to it. And so I've not, other than my career, which I'm truly grateful for, which is, kind of see me through the Linux Foundation, and also Lloyd's Banking Group and, into NatWest. I've not earned anything, directly from London JS. There's no shareholders. We don't ask for money. We ask, for sponsors of food and drink and, somebody to put the event on, which generally means a projector, somewhere that can house up to 100 people. But we don't take money at the door. The meetup is there, to further the industry. It's there to grow individual people's careers. I don't know what it is. It's just something about, you just got to pay it forward, and this is kind of like an effort of mine to pay it forward. I live in Brighton and I'm doing a London meetup, and so, it's, I could do it down here, I suppose, but there's just, yeah.
I've got a theory I'm going to advance, which is that I feel like conferences and meetups and things like this are like sort of distilled serendipity. Often throughout your job, just random stuff will happen, and some of it's useful. That's sort of serendipitous, right? But when you go to a conference, you're not looking for anything. You're just bumping into people and making connections, and new information is being handed to you that you weren't really after learning in the first place. Whereas, if you go onto Google or whatever and you type in something, you're going to get back an answer. You have to actually ask for something and get something back. Whereas at a conference or a meetup, it's just random bits of information that are on a particular topic being thrown at you. So I kind of feel like when you were talking about people starting startups and stuff, I feel like that is that exact type of serendipity being played out there. And I don't know where else you get that. That feels like a really specific thing that happens most at conferences. And
I don't know, maybe a hackathon, because what we encouraged was, so the people at the meetup, they wouldn't be, like I was saying, the superheroes of the industry that you might get a KubeCon or, you might get a bigger event. There were people, and they still are people, like, and I don't mean to say this, they're just, people who love, what they do, and, I'm not devaluing kind of like, the talks that people give, because, they're absolutely amazing, but there's not a barrier like, how many followers do they have on a social media platform, or, are they a lead maintainer of, a well-adopted, JavaScript framework? They're not necessarily the faces of the industry that you may recognize. And, we encourage people to bring their laptops along and, share their work. And so I think, if you've got a crowd of people looking at a great idea, and, that sparks interest, from other people who want to get involved. It could go down the route that both you and I have gone down. It could go down, becoming a lead maintainer or a maintainer or contributor to an Apache 2, project. But, we don't exclude, people, making money out of, their ideas. And some people have chosen to do that, and I've had people come back, 5 years later saying, thank you for this. If it wasn't for, London JS or the meetup previously, I wouldn't be in the career that I'm in. And I'm like, all I've done is got people together,
Yeah.
thank you for that.
Well, that's it. When I'm trying to select like speakers or like rank speakers for OSFF, the thing I'm mainly looking for is this going to, like, are a group of people going to be interested in this topic, and is it
Yeah.
likely to delight them if they attend it? I don't really care if it's somebody famous or if,
No,
I'm mainly trying to answer that question. And
that's it.
obviously it has to be super, focused on what the topic of the conference is, I guess, if otherwise people are going to be like, this is not what I came for. But
And I think, if there is something that is needed in that type of event, it's got to have a good feel. You've got to have a certain kind of aura around it.
Right.
People have got to be made to feel, welcome and safe. I think, without kind of, certain key ingredients, you won't necessarily, arrive at the culture that's needed in order to breed that kind of, collaboration that's needed, or that interest. And so I think that you're right. You do need a certain amount of, don't know what it is. Kind of, it's got to be part of you. It can't be cynical. I've seen, people trying to put on cynical events and, sell tickets for it, and they just don't work.
Yeah.
People they don't get the feeling, it's got to be part of your soul, I suppose. And I'm pleased that I arrived there. I'm pleased that I do it.
Well, I think this is one of the things I learned from you when I joined FINOS, was like your dedication to the community, and the way you always try and put the community first and think about how they're going to feel about a particular thing. It's kind of an amorphous quantity, the community, but you nevertheless really sort of tried to engender. I tried to, follow you in that respect, I think.
Oh, nice one. Well, thank you for that. I always love it, when people say things like that, because, you are right. There is a misunderstanding about community. It doesn't feel like you can measure it. And sometimes it is actually really difficult to measure. But the one thing that, whether you're working anywhere, it doesn't matter where you are, right? Whether you're in a large enterprise, or whether you're in a startup, basically, the community are the people who have got to deliver the projects that you need delivering.
Yeah.
And it's not about community. It's about, making people feel like they're valued, and they've got a purpose, and that's all it is, Plus, you've also got to take people to water as well. And so, you may be able to bring people together, but generally they also need to know what to do. And that is the side that maybe people don't, see, when you're badged as kind of like, a community person, because there's a lot of effort that kind of goes into, constructing kind of like the roadmap of work that community needs to do. Just bringing people together doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to actually achieve anything. You've got to bring the community together and then put people to work. And when you're talking about collaboration within an enterprise, or an open source community, across multiple time zones, if people don't understand their value and purpose and what it is that they're there to do, then they'll come and then they'll drift away. So you need a lot of energy, because you've got to build that momentum, and you kind of keep on communicating it. It's not easy. It's really hard.
You mentioned hackathons a minute ago as being a bit like the meetups and the conferences thing, and so my experience of hackathons is that I'm just in a room with a bunch of people banging away on the keyboard all day long, just trying to get something to work. And I don't really get much of a chance to like go around the hackathon and like chat to people in that kind of serendipitous way. But I'm wondering if you've been to one in maybe the last year or year and a half, because I reckon things might have changed now that we've got like agentic AI coding. Maybe
Mm.
everyone's less stressed about it, or they're getting stuff done more easily. What do you think? Have
Yeah.
you experienced that yet?
I think, part of the appeal about hackathon is kind of that sense of urgency, the whole, rush to the finish line, to get something done.
I'm not doing it wrong then.
No, I don't think that. I think that there's supposed to be a little bit of like a Grand Prix,
Yeah.
I think the bit that is quite similar to, London JS, is that self-organizing aspect, where people were bringing ideas together, and maybe, presenting, you know, so last week, so we had London JS last week, and there was a guy, who presented that he had created his own, it was like an extension to JavaScript, which was quite similar to TypeScript, but it, kind of added more features to it.
Huh.
Um,
Okay.
and, you know, it was something that it was a vision that he could see because, TypeScript was lacking something. And so rather than, just put up with TypeScript, he thought, oh, okay, we've now got Claude, Claude will be able to help me. Can I actually demonstrate what I mean by, creating a prototype and get something working through GitHub? And, he might be just one person at that time, and he might only have like, half a dozen stars in his repo. But by getting up and presenting it and bringing the idea, to a crowd, you can kind of, you can invite your followers and get people involved. And that to me is quite similar to a hackathon because, you might, there'll be a hackathon that has a purpose, so it might be sponsored, by a particular firm or group of firms because they want to drive a certain, type of outcome. And they might have, a few use cases that they want to, deliver against. But generally, unless you know your team, a lot of, the people who get together on those can be self-organizing, and then they've got to share ideas and come up with a bit of a game plan. The thing that I find with hackathons is, in my experience of running them, and I haven't run one for a long, long time, right? There are people who are way more qualified in running hackathons. It's now an industry, whereas before it was
Yeah.
like a little bit more, self-organizing. But it's the lead up to the hackathon. So the onboarding of people onto systems prior to the actual event. And then it's the carrying on with that idea after the hackathon. I always think that it's a bit of a shame if, you do the, getting people onboarded, getting them to use, or understanding the systems for the hack. They then develop their project and they go through all of the demos and, they pitch it to judges and everyone's applauding them. And then all of a sudden it's over and then they go back to their day jobs. And then all of those ideas rot in a repo somewhere. And I'm like, the whole thing is the day two, you've got to get into the day two, because you've got so many great ideas kind of living in a repo, kind of doing nothing. And it's a real shame that, some of them go stale. I'm not saying that they always do, but I've never really
No.
come across a killer project from a hackathon that's continued,
Yeah, we have some now. Actually, some of the stuff in FINOS repos is from hackathons.
Really.
Yeah,
That's really good.
actually merged into the trunk or the main or whatever.
But it's high energy, isn't it? Kind of keeping that
Yeah.
that kind of momentum going. You can feel it burning away. It's like, got to keep it going, got to keep it going. And it's like a real, you're kind of trying to project the energy into the people on the opposite side of your Zoom call. And it's...
Yeah, and the irony is that the whole name of a hackathon makes it sound like it's a long thing. But actually developing software over a 24-hour period, that's peanuts. That software is something you develop over years and years and years. And so, it's kind of a misnomer really, isn't it?
Yeah, and I've seen some great things come out the back of a hackathon, and also probably from university groups, if I'm honest. You kind of think that all of the, answers are going to come from the veterans, but it rarely does. It comes from like the energized students and, boot campers and, people who've still in touch with their creativity. They haven't kind of, been, taken away from that whole kind of, idea and learning kind of aspect of tech. It's really great to see.
They haven't been worn down by years of having their hackathon entries dropped on the floor and forgotten about.
Yeah. There are people who make a lot of money from hackathons. So a friend of mine,
Yes.
Sam Larson-Disney, he's written a book about it. He's kind of got this whole kind of phasing of how you should prepare and then how you should develop and how you should deliver and present to the judges. And, he kind of goes for the main prizes.
Okay, yes, because I had Kunal Kushwaha on here, one of the earlier episodes of the podcast, and he actually runs a lot of hackathons, and it's all about for him it's all about finding it's usually companies that have like a product like an API or something, and then he'll like line them up. He'll like line up their hackathon the contestants to use that API, and it gives them like huge amounts of feedback on what works and what doesn't work in their product. It's
That's
like
really
like a UAT essentially, but with like a captive audience over a very short space of time. And all they have to do is like give away a few iPhones or something, and people are motivated to give it a go. And those are the kind of people you want, right? Because they've not seen the product before. They're coming in completely new, and they're like supposed to hit the ground running. And so you see all the problems, and you get to experience the whole like developer onboarding process hundreds of times over in a very short space of time, and see what's not gonna fly.
I mean, that's a really good thing. I can see that working for quite a few products actually, especially the API based ones, or the low code products, that take you through a process. Like your Postman type products, where you can deliver things, with a lot less friction. I could see that being a really good, UAT type use case.
And NatWest had a hackathon recently, or you were involved in a hackathon. Are you allowed to talk about this? Is that?
Oh, yeah.
That's public, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, we've been involved in a couple of hackathons through FINOS. So let me think. I've got to queue these up correctly. So the last hackathon that we did publicly was one called Hack for a Cause, which was run out of, so anybody, globally could enter it. It was organized in partnership with FINOS, which is great because NatWest are FINOS members. So we're FINOS Gold members. We're members of the Linux Foundation. We're also members of CNCF and also FinOps. But, this one in particular was run, with the FINOS team in FINOS Labs. And it was all about education in India, because we have, a massive community of software engineers in India. And so they've got, a real, just, the same as you and I, we understand, what is needed in the UK in order to help educate, people who are, unable to get, access to education in the way that maybe you and I were able to at the time. In India, they've also got the same drive. I believe that the government in India is trying to drive people out of poverty and into, technology education. But sometimes it's not quite so easy when you don't come from a family that has, access to money and funds. So Hack for a Cause was a way that open source could actually be used to develop, products that engage with AI, that opened up education for people, from underprivileged backgrounds. And it was really well attended, from university groups, NatWest engineers. I believe that there are a number of different, maybe even FINOS members, who got involved and, started contributing to this. And all of those projects went towards a product that is being developed by, a guy within NatWest, a guy called Uman Doctor, who is, running a charity over in India in order to be able to, bring more people into technology from those groups. Yeah, it's absolutely phenomenal. And then we also ran a hackathon the year before, but I can't quite remember what it's called. It'll come back to me kind of like in 3 minutes' time. And so, yeah, and we've got involved in DTCC as well.
Why is it important to NatWest to do hackathons? What's the thinking behind that?
Oh, so that is actually a really interesting question. So it kind of comes from, maybe 2 or 3 different angles. Yeah. So if I run through them, so off the top of my mind, I'm thinking that there are 3 different reasons, but, it could be that there are more. I think the first is you can't always solve problems by being around the same people all of the time, because if you think about it, if you're solving problems within the same team and you're not kind of getting an external perspective, you lose that diversity of thought that can actually bring new ideas and, different methodologies for solving problems in a different way. Plus, also, if you're looking internally all of the time at the various different, technologies that you've got available to you, you can lose sight, of how the industry is evolving, and the different technologies that are available to you as the industry evolves. And if I give you a direct example, I've worked, within enterprise. Well, I'll go back, even before then. When I was, in the early part of my career, and I was working, predominantly as a, Microsoft developer. You would see everything outside of that as competition and probably wrong, so there would be, the .NET framework was the best thing to develop against. This would be your, opinion at that time. Java can't, compare to it. Microsoft have provided you everything that you need in order to be able to develop. You've got all of your qualifications, tools, and, learning materials to hand. I'm a Microsoft developer, you can't tell me that I'm wrong. If you kind of like continue with that, the evolution of technology can actually accelerate and evolve, outside of that opinion. And it's really important that you don't become, too deeply rooted into the ways in which, your teams and even the enterprise, develops and moves things forward. Because, I'm sure that you've experienced it, in enterprise banks, and probably in enterprises, in general. A lot of the technology can get rooted in there, and you can be developing against, versions of software and, even, within, engineering ecosystems that might be down the maturity curve, or it might have kind of like passed across the maturity curve and might be sunsetting. And unless you're, engaging with people outside of, your 4 walls, you may not know this. And, your own personal skills may not be as transferable as what you think. And so open source, and also hackathons allow you to step outside of that environment and, see, what is actually happening on the outside, and not only observe, how technology is changing, but also invite people in, who are engaging within, that technology shift, in order to be able to show you how things can be engineered and solved from a different angle, baking yourself into one mindset and kind of, one type of, technology is actually really dangerous, probably more so for yourself than for, the actual technology choice, and so it's really important to, bring that diversity of thought and diversity of technology, in. Outside of, that whole, technology landscape, it's really important that people know that your firm is on the roadmap, or as part of industry, I should say, because, you want to be inviting that type of thinking to come and work inside the firm. Not only do you want people to, be learning that, you are a lot more, further ahead in your thinking that people may perceive you to be, But you want to be able to attract that rich talent to come and work. So not only do you, find and get introduced to new people at the hackathon, but then you can invite people to come and join, the firm and diversify, the inner teams even further. And then the third one is, through FINOS, all of our, hackathon projects have been Apache 2 licensed and available through GitHub. And so not only are we, developing, to learn more about technology and then to invite great minds, into those hackathons. But then we're also, putting them on GitHub, for other people to be able to leverage and take forward, even outside of NatWest. And so, anybody can get involved and, fork it, take it forward and maybe come back with something, totally new. And so I think that pretty much covers it,
Yeah.
I would say not getting entrenched, that's like a big one for individuals. I mean, I don't know if you've got any kind of, observations about people getting entrenched in their beliefs and the world then passes you by and you're like, oh my God, what am I going to do?
I've got a few like this. I think one of the reasons you like those clusters of firms, like you will get the FIDI, the financial district in cities, is so that they can get that cross-pollination of ideas between different firms. So yeah, I think that's why firms cluster together in like financial districts to try and share ideas. And I think you're right. It's a super important thing with technology. If you're not sharing ideas, you're going to get left behind.
Yeah.
But it almost seems like, I mean, that is definitely a good reason for doing hackathons, but there's lots of ways of sharing technological ideas, and open source being like one of them. I don't know. I think there's also the talent aspect as well. People like to, show up and do a hackathon because it like demonstrates their ability and it sort of like shows them to other parts of the firm, that kind of thing. And
oh yeah, definitely. Yeah.
often there's publicity,
there's
isn't there?
definitely, yeah. I don't know if I've kind of come across kind of personal publicity, in as much as, kind of I don't know, the challenge of, picking up something and, maybe there is, so, maybe it's about, the product at the end of it. I've seen engineers come together because they truly want to develop the best thing. I've not necessarily seen people, even if they have come first, try and step in front of the product and, celebrate their own personal success. It's always been about the team, and I don't know whether,
Yeah, or the
that is
product
just,
itself, isn't it? The idea.
yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know if that is kind of like just a personality trait of the type of people who get involved in hackathons, but,
Could be.
yeah, which is a good thing. It's really nice, to see people celebrating as a team and celebrating the success of the product. You know, and that's the spirit of it. That's the spirit of open source.
Do you think open source has become more corporate over like the last 10 years or so? How do you see that evolving?
I don't. That's actually a really good question, and I think it depends on your vantage point of the industry. I think within financial services, we've probably got more of a corporate view of it, compared to a lot of the engineers, who come to London JS, and who are also involved in open source, who may not be part of a regulated industry, where open source is kind of like being part of who they are from university through, their career. So I'm not entirely sure whether it has become more corporate or whether we belong to a more corporate side of it. I would say that what I've noticed, within my own evolution is that I'm not even going to say that, right? I was going to say maybe it's more of the standards, that are really financial services are starting to align to. But then I thought, well, actually, you've got products, like Flux Nova, which is a standalone product, which has got a lot of momentum. Funnily enough, tonight, just before I actually came onto the podcast, because I'm on holiday at the moment, but in true James kind of like, can't stay away from my phone, I kind of tapped into one of my Teams messages, and a person who I know, he's totally disconnected from Fluxnova, said that they're speaking at a meetup in India. Can I put them in contact with somebody from Fluxnova because they need to find out more about the project? And I thought, actually, that's really good because, number one, they led with Fluxnova, so the brand is there, and people are recognizing it, and, they're being asked to represent and talk about it, at a meetup. And so the value and the purpose of it is clearly understood. And then the other thing is that they're asking for a community connection, which I'm able to give because, people within NatWest are also contributing to it, and help maintain the product, And so I was going to say about standards, because finance is full of standards and regulation, and controls, but, even the, products, are standing up on their own now. And that's fantastic to see.
Yeah, I'm going to venture an opinion on this. I think, we have this piece of research in like the LF where it's like 90 or 95% of all code in whatever product it is, whether it's like a phone or a browser, whatever, is all open source code, or a washing machine, whatever. And also you've got to think open source is kind of eating the world, isn't it? Like software is eating the world. Like it's Mark,
Yeah.
what was his name?
Oh, I'm not sure.
Is it Mark Andreessen who said this? Maybe. Anyway,
I'll defer to you, Rob. You steered yourself down that road.
Well, anyway, the point being is that like if the whole of society is kind of running on open source code, it kind of has to become more grown up and more organized and more corporate in a way. It's kind of almost obligatory, isn't it? If all these corporations are going to rely on it. But I think there's something at the very root of it, the very heart of it, the idea of people collaborating on something for their own sort of benefit, but also for the selfish improvement of the thing. That kind of nub of the idea sort of determines what the community is going to look like, and therefore what the people are that are going to be involved in it.
Yeah. Do you know what? I'm going to take your observations and kind of like throw in a controversial view. That may or may not get me into trouble. So I think sometimes, enterprises have got open source wrong, right? The understanding of open source wrong. So it's always good to, go in there with like a bit of a controversial statement. But when I look at, so when I first started at FINOS, I was immensely privileged, probably in 2019 before COVID, to be invited over to New York, to meet the team for the first time, if I'm honest with you. So it's the first kind of like week or two that I joined. And it just so happened to be, I don't know why
I'm laughing because this exact same thing happened to me as well.
Right. I'm not, well, maybe it did, but maybe it didn't. Yeah. So this is a totally different, it might be a different story, right? So at that time, it was around October. And, October is kind of like Halloween month. And so at the beginning of October, you've got Hacktoberfest, that starts, which is, open source wide. It's sponsored by DigitalOcean. I still think that it exists. I'm not entirely sure. I think it came under a little bit of scrutiny, but, at that time it was really popular. And DigitalOcean kicked it off in New York. And so that kind of kicking off ceremony happened when I was over there. And through the Linux Foundation, I was invited to go. And so I was the only person from the team. So, I was literally an Englishman in New York. If anybody's old like me, you'll know the Sting reference. And I didn't know New York at all, and so I was kind of making my way around, at that time. And I went over to DigitalOcean, and bearing in mind that, my reference point was financial services, because I just left Lloyd's to join FINOS. And when you're inside a bank, you're doing a lot of selling, of the reasons why you've got to contribute to open source. And you're taking a lot of people to water And so you're introducing people to, the reasons why you do it and how you do it and how you do it safely. And so you kind of put all of the controls in place. And it's, it can be high effort because there's a lot of kind of like, people's emotions, like what I was saying about, being a Microsoft developer, trying to convince people to become open source from being fully proprietary, it's a bit of a sell, I don't think in my early days, somebody would convince me to start contributing into a GitHub repo, and so you've got to, there's a lot of trust involved in that. So coming from that, kind of background, especially, at that time, all of the banks were kind of like closed to contributing to open source. And so you're fighting a different battle. I went to DigitalOcean and there was like PhD students there just contributing all of their materials to open source. You had firms like DigitalOcean just contributing all of their code to open source. You had people from Meta who were contributing Docusaurus and, React and, all of their projects to open source. And I was like, this is just totally different, because, you have people coming out of university who are expecting, to be able to contribute to open source, in order to further the world. It was their kind of, emotional connection to what they're doing within technology, because outside of that, they may have had, some other form of career that would, be more ESG and environmental kind of, based. And so people had like a real connection to, furthering society. And so I kind of went from a environment of high friction to an environment of no friction. And the thing that I learned was that open source isn't about, in that, you need to think about intellectual property, yes, but it was just where the repo was. The difference was you're doing your work, you're giving yourself, whatever license, kind of, suits your appetite. Not everything needs to be MIT. You can be a little bit more restrictive. But the repo was just out there, and it furthered education because PhD students were immediately committing their work to GitHub and people were looking over it and giving comments, and it's not, in my view, I think that, yes, within finance, we need to keep ourselves safe, but if you come in from the London JS kind of like angle where from boot campers all the way through to seasoned engineers, they're just contributing their work in there and, they're asking for feedback from people who they don't know. It's just a different view of the world, and I think that we need to figure out if we've got IP that we need to keep safe. Yes, we keep that safe. If we've got stuff that furthers engineering, then we should just further engineering, just get it out there, because that's the way the, technology evolves. That's the way AI is evolving. It's evolving too fast to kind of, hoard things. You've just got to, let it breathe and allow people to, leverage and then also allow people to contribute back. So yeah, that's my controversial statement. And I would never have known that if it wasn't for working in the LF,
And going to the DigitalOcean thing.
Yeah. And,
Yeah.
you may have seen, that from working within the banks that you've worked within. Going to, the Linux Foundation kind of gives you a different kind of like perspective to open source.
Well, I think, yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. But I think, I've spent a long time in banking, and I think the culture of this open source culture and the technology culture has slowly seeped in, and it's become more and more prevalent in banking now. I mean, that problem that you're talking about of banks wanting to keep stuff secret, but then let technology be technology. That's definitely true now. But a few years ago, it was like everything should be secret. Technology should be secret. And that's the change. That's the tide changing direction that I can see because of the rise of open source, the rise of technology. This, look, the market cap of all the big tech firms dwarfs the banks now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which I think kind of brings us onto AI, right? And I know you're doing lots of experiments with AI lately.
Who, me personally?
Well, yeah, you've got a new vibe coding podcast thing going.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I forgot about that. Yeah. So, yeah, I'm kind of, so to conclude the previous one, just quickly, people need to, if you're working in banking, Don't hyper focus internally on what you're doing here and now. Join the open source community at whatever meetup it is. It doesn't have to be mine, doesn't have to be an LF event. It can be, just getting people together around a table and sharing some ideas, some common kind of like industry ideas. Don't breach competition law and start, giving internal secrets away. We're not asking for that. This is the risk podcast, and that is a risk. But anything that you would find in a university textbook, or any product that is open source derived that you would find in AWS or, on the CNCF or FINOS, landscape, just go out and start talking about it and, figure out the problems that everyone's, experiencing, and see if you can figure out answers to that, collectively, amongst a different group of people. And
Or
that's great.
get in touch with open source by joining a hackathon, right? Because that's another opportunity to do open source, isn't it?
Exactly. You bring such a different perspective. You don't, be part of the world that I described, which is, internally focused and scared of the outside. Go out there and explore it. It's an amazing place. And that does kind of like bring us to AI, because you're right. I've always been somebody who likes to think that I can see kind of like further into the horizon. I've always been somebody who likes to try and pivot, and really understand, how, technology is shifting. But at the same time, hence kind of like this whole React thing, previously, the people who were at the center of, React over in San Francisco were being flown over to teach a few people in London, how to do it, and so I kind of understand, how, technologies they're being presented, and you're being asked to use, but without people to guide you, can be quite a scary place. And this is where we're at with AI right now. We're kind of being given access to tools, with the expectation, that we know how to use it. Not really, some people, have the experience of having to pivot before. Other people may not have had that experience, or, may not have had to do it before. And so putting your hand up and kind of admitting that you don't know something can be quite scary when you think that everybody else knows. The truth is, we're all figuring this stuff out together.
Yeah.
And what you need is some muggins, to put their hand up and say, well, do you know what? Truthfully, I haven't got a clue. What I'm going to do is, bring all of my learning, onto a live stream of all things, and, share my learnings week on week. It's a bit of a, big commitment. But me and Gergely, so Gergely Krishna and myself, so we're both, working for NatWest, and, we thought to ourselves at the beginning of the year, Gergely's actually an active like Twitch streamer, and so he knows a little bit more about it than me, and so it's actually a really good pairing, because he's able to, I'm using open broadcast system to stream live over YouTube, and he's bringing, his perspective, because he's an AI developer, so he engineers with AI inside NatWest, and so it's kind of like a bit of a generational kind of like, coming together as well, which is what it's all about. So I'm learning something new. Gergely's learning something new. I'm kind of putting it out there that, I'm starting net new and, building my experience. I also, put my ramblings on LinkedIn, talking about what I've observed and how I see things coming about. Not because I'm kind of, trying to tell people that I'm an expert in this area, but it's more of if you don't have people kind of, being honest and saying this stuff, this stuff is new, we've all got to learn how to do it, how am I going to pretend that I'm an expert from day one? If you don't have somebody say, well, actually, we're not experts from day one, I'm willing to put my hand up and say that. Anyway, I hope it's kind of been coherent. But anyway, that's kind of like the idea behind it.
I think that is exactly the idea behind it. It's like, we've opened Pandora's box here and pulled out like a chainsaw or something.
Yeah.
And everyone's now trying to figure out how to cut wood safely with it without losing a limb or something. And the only way
Yeah.
we're going to do that with something as complicated as AI is by having lots of people sharing their ideas and getting like that, building that internal model of the risks involved in AI. And then we can start to think about like safeguards and guardrails and controls like your colleague
Yes.
Paul Donger's doing.
Yes. Yes.
It's only by doing that as a group, as a society, almost like an open source community, that we can hope to like do this in a safe way and figure this all out.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I think that open source lends itself, perfectly to AI. So, outside of, and not everybody needs to broadcast themselves over YouTube to learn this stuff, seriously. I mean, that's kind of like just, me, that's just who I am. But if you look at the center of where this came from, a lot of us, including myself, have been introduced to AI because the products are there, you know, after decades of research, in order to get us here. LLMs didn't appear on their own. There's been, countless decades and years of, machine learning. Even before then, there was like neural network, type of, artificial intelligence that people are still researching. But if you look at, so I remember Hugging Face, when that first entered the market, thinking, what is this? And to some extent, I think it's, still a little
Still
bit
think
of
that.
like a niche kind of, community of people who know that it's there. If you're into, really figuring out how to install models locally and, who actually produces them, then you might, kind of come into contact with Hugging Face a little bit more. But, if you look at Hugging Face being kind of a open source, registry of, different models that you can consume, and then look at the way that all of those models are being built and how they've come together and how they've been researched. I don't know. I'm not going to put, a percentage of it when it comes to open source, but, even within the LF, you've got, PyTorch, which was contributed to the LF by Meta, I believe. A lot of that has been, being used in order to teach models.
Yeah.
A lot of the models that you can get now, some are proprietary, so your Anthropics and your OpenAIs, but you've got NVIDIA who are contributing open source models through Nemotron and various different, Llama or Olama based, models coming, from both Meta and also from Asia. And of course, DeepSeek that kind of, disrupted the US for a while, being contributed from China. Open source is kind of like, at the center of a lot of what's being done within AI.
Yeah. I'm having a lot of fun with like Quen and Gemma on my computer, although it does struggle. But actually,
give me a second.
I kind of, all right.
I've got a little Quen model running on this Raspberry Pi.
Amazing.
Yeah, so this is kind of like an 8 gig Raspberry Pi with like 256 gigs. It's got like a little Quen, I don't know, I can't remember the version, 3.1, something. But it's kind of like their entry level model. They'll run on a Raspberry Pi. I tried to get OpenClaw running on it, which I did.
Wow.
But it wasn't able to, do too many operations. So it wasn't like you would get on a headless, Mac Mini. But I was able to run Telegram through it and get it to, process one operation or maybe act like a prompt injection guard or something like that. But you can get like small kind of like 4 gig, models running on, such a small device.
Yeah.
Quen is actually really good. So that's where I'm going with that. And I've not used Gemma, but I've had, people who have been able to get stuff out of Gemma and some people who haven't been able to get anything out of it at all. So I think it kind of depends on the hardware that you're running it on. But yeah, it'd be good to hear what you've managed to do with them.
Yeah, well, I've been trying to play with this code editor called Zed, and I've installed various different models and got them to work with Z. However, getting them to actually edit code has been a bit problematic, and it's not completely working. So I've been falling back on Cursor and doing stuff with that. But I'm
Yeah.
sure I'll get it working eventually. I think it's kind of still early days. Also, my Mac every now and again will just heat up and like completely lock up. So I clearly need some way more powerful hardware to
Yeah.
use these things properly.
And
So
that is the thing. I think
yeah.
it is about the hardware. But I do think Apple are bringing out like a next gen of, MacBook Pro where they actually do have, AI specific chips inside now. I don't know
Oh
whether
yeah,
they're.
almost can't wait to blow another $5,000 on some
Yeah.
some new Mac hardware. James, I think we should wrap this up, but I wanted to ask you one last question, which is that
Yes.
I think this moment we're having with AI kind of mirrors what you were saying at the beginning with London JS. You were saying we've got this JavaScript ecosystem forming, so many different choices, nobody knows what they're doing. So I guess the last question is when are we going to see London AI community form?
Oh, that's actually really interesting. So we need to be careful, right? So I know that people are expecting kind of like a lot of enthusiasm around it, and I am deeply enthusiastic around AI. But it's also got for all of the pros that it brings, it does actually bring a few kind of counter pros. I'm not going to say cons,
Oh, really?
I don't want to be so negative. But what we found within the London JS community is that it's actually, contributing to people not being able to find jobs kind of like within the community. And the whole thing about, bringing communities together is that you need to be emotionally intelligent, around the people who are also part of that as well. And so within London JS, we're trying to be kind of, well balanced with the AI talks that come because in all honesty, AI is starting to bleed into, the JavaScript community as well. And so I would
Sure.
say
Yeah.
that, 2/3 of our talks now are AI, relevant, with the, the other third being, something which is, a lot more JavaScript typical. But if we were to rebrand, pivot, or lean too hard into AI, you bring a lot of people with you, but you also exclude a lot of people who are actually going through not so easy times right now. And so what I'm actually hoping is that, the people who, maybe have been out of work for like 6 months, because, I know a few, they're still, not being excluded, or they don't feel, kind of the emotional difficulty of joining the community because people are celebrating kind of the technology that has led them into difficult times. But we're able to, bring them into still an emotionally intelligent community that can provide the skills they're needed in order to get them back up and running again. And so I would say that that is my observation of this. If you're running an AI specific meetup, still be, emotionally kind of attached to the people who you're inviting in, knowing that some people are greatly benefiting from it, but there are some people who are not. And, the people who are benefiting need to give a leg up to those who aren't. And it kind of goes, and I'm not saying that the people who aren't the people who, didn't pivot, it's all about timing and opportunity. And, sometimes it's luck, sometimes it's, maybe your startup didn't get the round of funding. Some things are in your control, some things are out of your control.
Yeah,
But
it's politically charged in a way that perhaps the JavaScript community isn't it? Everyone's got a political opinion about AI at the moment.
yeah,
However, having said that, I don't know, I think there's an awful lot of hype about the whole jobs thing at the moment. So in Britain, we have a really interesting set of headwinds going on right now, especially in London. And I don't think it's really possible to lay our problems on the front door of AI at this point in time. It's kind of, there's so many other things happening.
yeah.
But,
No,
but
I
yeah,
do see
it is
that.
something that it's a hot button issue, and I get your point.
Yeah. And, so we have come across, a couple of situations where people have, and we want to be, it's going to sound really odd, maybe it's not so odd. We've always been extremely inclusive, about the people who come, from a diversity, equity and inclusion point of view. Um, just in general. And, we want to make sure that we are there to celebrate, everybody and give people opportunity to grow. Yeah. And, I don't want to celebrate something too openly because, because it's bringing
It's
great
a really good
benefits.
point.
Yeah.
I was hoping this was going to be one of those like last throwaway funny questions of the whole thing, but you've kind of given me the most thoughtful and sincere answer of the whole thing.
But, it's because people have, asked that. And to be quite honest with you, I kind of stumbled into that because I spoke to people about, why don't we pivot? And this was the insight that they gave me. And being part of a community, sometimes it's about speaking, but quite often it's about listening, and this was the insight. But, to finish it on a high, 2/3
Hold on, before you do that, just isn't it more of a fork than a pivot? Like to have, I don't think you need to get rid of the JS to have a...
Yeah. So you are right. I mean, I'm using AI a lot. It kind of it brings a lot of. It's opened up technology to me that, through time and commitment to things, was previously closed. So, for me, AI is a complete enabler. Everything that I've, learned through being on the live stream and everything else that I'm doing in the evening to, teach myself, is actually given me a lot of time back that I can spend engaging with technology in a different way that, maybe was just, unavailable to me because of my other, work, family, and also community commitments. And so for me, AI is a complete enabler. But I can see that because I've been through this loop before, with like what you're saying, the first cycle with London JS and, React. And so I'm kind of following that trail again.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, for me, it's, amazing. I just want everybody to be able to benefit from it, which means that I've got to listen to the mood and then, steer myself into that and just be really mindful about it.
I was in a cab the other day and the cab driver was telling me about how he was like vibe coding like a taxi management application, and he was setting up websites, and like he was saying, oh yeah, you can't book a taxi without having it recorded somewhere because of laws and stuff. Like this is what Uber does. And if he wants to operate outside of Uber, he has to have his own system. So he was vibe coding this thing. He was talking about, I'm doing this in Claude, and I've got this thing happening in ChatGPT, and then I copy the results here and do all this. And I was just, my head was like, my hands were coming out. I was just like, oh my God, this is scary. This guy's got no idea of software development, but yeah, he's gone in with, head first into this whole thing and is building this stuff. There's a lot of people out there who really need the leadership and the guidance of a community to help them get this stuff right.
Yeah, I think so. But that's the subject for a different podcast. And I'm willing to divulge kind of like what I'm up to, to steer myself away from kind of just getting caught in the headlights of vibe coding. But yeah, that is another 30 minutes.
Well, James, this has been fantastic. You've been amazing.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
It has. It's been
is there anything else you want to say
lesson.
before we go? Or?
No. So the only thing I will say is, feel free to, connect with both Rob and myself on LinkedIn. We're both active on there. We've got various different, meetups, community groups and conferences, coming into the summer. Any questions, just, ping it in the comments and, the same old community spiel, it, Rob.
Yeah. Get involved, like and subscribe.
Yes. Absolutely. Like and subscribe. But no, it's been an absolute pleasure and I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah,
I think,
fun.